Hi, thank you everybody for watching Hard Road of Hope. I'm Rick Hamilton, Managing Director of The Chain, and we are delighted that filmmaker Eleanor Goldfield is here to talk with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I just kind of want to briefly start off of how did you stumble in on this subject? Are you West Virginia native? Are you connected to the area in any way?
I'm not. I did grow up in the South partially, but I'm not from West Virginia. I stumbled onto it because I've worked as a journalist for quite some time, and one of the things that was very important for me as a journalist was to actually go to places so that I'm not getting the story secondhand, because this is the problem with corporate media is they just take somebody's word for it and then it's usually wrong. So it was important for me to go to these frontline fights, and that included pipeline fights in Louisiana and Pennsylvania, water fights in the West. And so initially, my plan was to go to West Virginia to get stories, to gather stories to write about, and also to feature on a weekly TV show that I had on Free Speech TV. And I soon realized that I was collecting a lot of stories that required going deeper. And I hadn't really intended on becoming a filmmaker, but I thought, oh, well, there's a medium that allows you to go a little bit deeper. And I think it's called a film. So I just kind of fell into it because of the need to really dig deeper into these stories.
It's fantastic. It's really, really well put together and such an interesting scope. So you kind of, I think there's a gentleman that sort of ends there with a place that I thought was just so fascinating of it doesn't really matter whether you're, looking at a creek or a school or a street, everything is political. That seems to ring especially true in 2020. If we think about like 20 years ago in West Virginia, how they were so nationally politically democratic, and how that's really turned with the rise of sort of the natural energy movement, the green energy, each way you want to go about it. It's really interesting to then, what I was not aware of was how deeply rooted they were in, the sort of labor movement. As a New Yorker, I think of Union Square as being the start of that. But so that was fascinating. And is that something that you kind of stumbled into? Is that really a part of their core being when you were there in a Maryland?
So I've actually, the hazards of being a historian's daughter. I actually knew about the radical labor movement in the South since I was a kid, and with that, I understood that there was a depropagandization that happened in the South. And one of the stories that one of the folks in the film talks about is the story of the word redneck,
Yeah.
and how that is actually the redneck is actually a working class hero. Because the redneck was a term that was used to kind of like connect people to each other during the mine wars, which happened at the turn of the 20th century. And they tied on red bandanas, and white and black mine workers marched together. They took up arms and fired on coal barons to demand basic worker rights that we take for granted, like no kids in the mines and being paid in actual money as opposed to company script. Um, so these are stories that have been not just buried but twisted, because nowadays if you call someone a redneck, there's usually like a Trump sticker on their car. It's not a term that you use for like a working class labor activist or something. And so that's really it's an interesting, not just from the side of, oh, they've buried this history so well, but they've twisted it and turned it to the exact opposite. People that instead of fighting their oppression are kind of taking a sick pride in their oppression. And that's been done perhaps better in southern rural areas than in anywhere else in the country. And even the people who grew up in these places, they live right around the corner from where the Matewan massacre happened in Matewan, West Virginia, which is close to Blair Mountain. And they didn't hear about the Matewan massacre. They just grew up hearing about how great coal is, and isn't it wonderful that we have these coal jobs and coal, coal, coal. Not, oh, we had to shoot at coal barons so that your grandfather didn't have to work in the mine at age 12 anymore. Like, that's not the story that's told. And so it's kind of one of the cornerstones of the film that I felt was important, was really uncovering this history, and that it is activism to share your history that's been buried for the purpose of continued exploitation at the hands of both corporations and the state.
And do you think how at some point is it how do you go from that doing right for the greater good to, in order to get food on our plate, we have to do something that's actually, we can't drink the water out of our glass so that we can eat food on our plate. Like how do they kind of reconcile, I needed this for me, even though it might be harming the country, the world, and even my family, really, when it come down to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and I think I've been doing community organizing for uh, almost 20 years now, since I was, an early teenager. And one of the things that I've always had, just giving me like an icky feeling, is that a lot of particularly leftists will go to like rural areas in the South and like talk down to people, and demonize them too. And the truth of the matter is that in West Virginia, you basically have two choices, and is particularly in the South where the coal, is still there are still coal jobs to be had, a diminishing amount, but your choices are work for coal and make a fair amount of money, or work at Walmart. And I think, any one of us that are faced with a decision that, watch your family starve or dig a bunch of dead dinosaur or dead trees out of the ground would choose that. And so I think like we have to, and this is something that we talk about in the film too, is that the ire and the anger is important, but direct it the right direction. It's not these people's fault that they are born into a community that doesn't have choices,
Right.
and that they don't have options to survive. And so the anger needs to be pointed upwards. Like, why are you banishing all kind of green energy options? Like, why aren't you subsidizing them as opposed to desperately trying to prop up a dying coal industry? And so that's really the larger issue, and trying to make allies of these folks that are really selling their bodies. I mean, because a lot of folks are still dying at age 40, 45 of black lung. Making allies of these folks as opposed to demonizing them the way that I think, unfortunately, some environmentalists have in the past.
Do you think that there's any, you talk about how the fracking industry came in and used the exact same playbook that the coal industry did. Is there any sense of mistrust then that the green energy would just be doing the same thing to them? That they would have their best interests in hearts? Is there any distrust in yet another group coming in saying, we know it's best for you?
There absolutely is, and this is why one of the things that in particular, former coal miners that work with the UMWA, which is the United Mine Workers of America union, are pushing. Like, yeah, let's have green jobs, but let's make sure that we have strong unions, because you can never trust the boss, right? And this is what this is what West Virginia has learned, and people kind of were surprised when the teacher strikes started in West Virginia. But then
Right.
if you look at the history, it's actually not that surprising.
I
um,
that in your thing. I was like, oh, wait a minute, they've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, so it's kind of like baked into their community DNA, and so I think that people are mistrusting of big corporations and big industry in not just in West Virginia, but I think in a lot of rural areas that have been completely destroyed or taken advantage of. But I think that they are ready to. A lot of folks are ready to make that transition. And as one of the folks a former mine worker says in the film, if you want to make an environmentalist, I'll tell you how to make an environmentalist. You take 500 coal miners and you put them to work in a reusable energy plant or something. And as long as they're with the union and they still have control over their wages and their worker rights, that's a good transition to make.
Yeah. Yeah. I also thought another thing that really resonated to me, it was you're so connected to an industry that when you say no to the industry, you're actually taking it personally. And I really thought like that's a mindset then that anybody who wants to come in and bring renewable energy sources or ways in, you can't just say what you're doing is bad. It definitely needs to hit them on the personal level.
Yeah, and I think that's a tremendous lesson for organizers and really just people that want to try and do something about this really large, like this rift that continues to grow in this country. Is that the more that we demonize folks for having to make difficult choices in a in an economy, in an environment that continues to spiral downwards, the more enemies we're going to create, and we actually need more allies, because the enemy is not on this level; it's on the level above. You're not the boot on the back of my neck is not my neighbors. It's the corporate state, and I think that it's an important lesson to learn, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to make the film, is that West Virginia is kind of a mirror that can be held up to the rest of the country, not just in terms of like a beautiful radical history, but in terms of the oppression that has been done to people at the in the name of progress,
Right.
and how we can fight back against that.
How do you feel that this culture that we've really been immersed in, this dissemination of misinformation, and when you talk about, like, in 1984, if you control the present, you control the future. How right now we're in a world where it doesn't really matter what side of the spectrum you're on, or even this in the middle. You assume that everybody else is getting their information from the wrong people. How do you then communicate that and be able to move forward?
Yeah, well, I think this is, as a journalist, one of the things that I work very hard on is media literacy, and I'm a board member of the Media Freedom Foundation that works on this issue very, very heavily, and puts out a book each year called Project Censored. And I think it's important that, again, like kind of circling back to your first question, one of the things that's always been important for me in my journalism work is that I'm talking to the source. I'm not calling the fracking company and being like, hey, so what's happening with this water? Like, is it poisoned? What do you think? Like, I'm going there and I'm talking to somebody who's actually like done the lab test. I'm talking to people who now have gallbladder disease or what have you. Like, and so I think that that is important for people when they're looking at media. Okay, well, this person says they're quoting some official at this company. Well, wouldn't they want to, cover their, I don't know if I can curse here, but
Sure.
you know, but like they would want to cover for themselves. So I think like engaging in media literacy is super important, and also understanding, as one of my mentors, former Black Panther Kilu Nyasha, put it to me, some folks are just going to die wrong. And that's, we have to accept that. And as much as we work to not just for ourselves become more media literate and question what we read and what we write as journalists as well, we have to understand that there's not going to be any point in time in history where everyone is on the same page, everyone knows exactly what the truth is, and full steam ahead.
Yeah.
So I think that that's part of the equation as well. But I think really it's about media literacy and understanding that corporate media, wherever you're hearing it, Fox News, CNN, MSN, that's question that a lot, like just don't watch it, but question it extremely well. And then when you look at alternative media outlets, really look at the sources of where people are getting information.
Do you have obviously went out and spoke to some really fascinating and quite a broad group of people. Do you have any follow-ups on some of those stories? Do you keep in touch with them, like the couple near the having the sound issue next to their house, or any of the water?
Yeah, I've kept in touch with a few folks, and during the pandemic, coal and fracking are still essential
Yeah.
work. And so that's unfortunately just that continues to be a problem. I've spoken to few people after the election, and they feel very laissez-faire. They are like a lot of folks in the South, I think, who we kind of cast away as like, oh, they're just Trump voters. What do they know? They actually know quite a bit. They're mistrusting of the Democrats for very good reason. And while I obviously completely disagree with their support of Trump, it's not always just that they love Trump. It's that they're very mistrusting of the system. And for some reason, because of the deep propagandization, they believe that Trump is an outsider when, of course, he's really not. But I think that, one of the things that I've continued to learn from folks in these areas is that the mistrust is kind of baked into their DNA. It's just a matter of like, oh, okay, well, you mistrust the Democrats, but how about also the Republicans, and then also the corporations, and then like we can keep moving outward, and then you direct your trust to your community members, and you don't like mistrust them because they come from a different place, or so I think there's a lot of like that powerful and really beautiful organizing happening on the ground still.
Well, it's a fantastic piece. I hope people take take what's here and then continue to, as you said, read it more into it. And I hope you continue to explore the subject. It's fascinating. I think you've done some great work here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you all for watching. Look for Eleanor Goldfield. Where can they find more of your work?
So the film, you can find out more about the film and more about all of the work that I do at my website, which is artkillingapathy.com.
Make sure you check that out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.